This story is about a black woman who endured everything that Jim Crow could throw at her. Injustice and racism took everything from her and her family. But she didn't break. And this story is also about the thousands of black women who came together to support her. The black women who, even though they were not enduring what she was, they didn't forget about her. They stayed by her side for over a decade. They said her name every chance they could. Rosa Lee Floyd was born around 1904 in Sumter County, Georgia, to Tom and Amy Floyd. She was the second oldest of 8 children. Her family were farmers, like most black people in their area. The Floyds grew cotton, and when Rosa was in her teens, her father Tom died. It was around this same time that she met a man named Jackson Ingram at church. When Rosa was 15 and Jackson was 20, the two married on a farm near Ellaville. Despite losing 2 babies in childbirth, Jackson and Rosa's family grew to 12 children. The Ingrams were a good family and were respected in their small community in Ellaville. Jackson was a hard-working man who provided for his family. However, things changed for the Ingram family in 1947. On August 5, 1947, Jackson died at the age of 53 after suffering a stroke. The family lost its protector and its provider, but Rosa and her older son stepped up to ensure that the family was taken care of. They continued to farm the land that they rented. The Ingrams were sharecroppers on a man named C.M. Dillinger's land. And like most black sharecroppers, they barely made enough to live. With Jackson's death, 1947 was a difficult year, and Rosa might have ended up owing Dillinger money. She had planned to leave his land and sharecrop on another farm. And Jackson's death had brought another problem. Her neighbor, a man named John Stratford, had been harassing her since Jackson's death. He also sharecropped the land owned by Dillinger. He continually made advances at Rosa and told her that if she became his mistress, he would help her with her financial problems. Rosa rejected him every time, and this angered Stratford. 3 months after Jackson died, everything changed for the worse for the Ingram family. On November 4th, 1947, it was a regular day for Rosa Lee Ingram and her family. The mother of 12 and her 4 older sons, 17-year-old Charles, 16-year-old Wallace, 14-year-old Sammy Lee, and 12-year-old James, were harvesting corn. By mid-morning, they had managed to harvest 2 loads. That's when John Stratford came barreling onto Rosa's farm, yelling at her about mules and hogs being on his land. Rosa told her sons, Sammy Lee and James, to continue pulling the corn while she went to look for hogs. Her other sons, Wallace and Charles, rounded up the mules. After looking for the hogs, Rosa decided to give up and began walking back towards her home. That's when Stratford had attacked her. He had gone back to his home and retrieved his .32 caliber weapon. He cursed Rosa and he threatened to take her life. He then hit her over the head with the butt of his weapon. He hit Rosa so hard that she thought that he pulled the trigger and fired at her. Rosa screamed for her life. Stratford then began choking her and nearly ripped off her sweater. Rosa fought back. Her sons heard their mother scream and came running to find out what was going on. When Stratford went to hit Rosa again, that's when her sons Wallace and Sammy arrived. 16-year-old Wallace begged Stratford to stop beating his mother, but Stratford kept attacking Rosa. One of the boys was able to wrestle the weapon away from Stratford, and during the struggle, Stratford was struck on the head with the weapon and fell down. He died from the blow to the head. When the police arrived, they spoke to Rosa and her boys. They all told them how Stratford came to their home and attacked Rosa, and they defended her. But the police had it set in their mind that it was not self-defense. They believed that Rosa and her sons were lying and that they intentionally took Stratford's life. Shelby County Sheriff Joe Devane arrested 40-year-old Rosa, along with her sons 17-year-old Charles, 16-year-old Wallace, 14-year-old Sammy Lee, and 12-year-old James. When they were arrested, the family were kept away from one another in separate locations, and they were not allowed to have contact with attorneys for 2 months while they were being held. The police claimed that in early December of 1947, Rosa gave them a statement about what happened. They said that Rosa and 2 of her sons told them that Stratford had not died during the fight at their home, but rather he died after the group had another fight that was closer to his cabin. But Rosa's oldest son, Charles, refused to change his story and maintained that only one fight had occurred. Now, this was a very critical point. It was important for the prosecution of the Ingrams that Stratford died in Shelby County. Stratford's cabin sat just inside the county border line. If Stratford's death was found to have occurred in Sumter County, Shelby County could not prosecute. A grand jury was convened, and on January 22, 1948, the Shelby County grand jury went with the belief that Stratford died inside the county, and it indicted Rosa, Wallace, Charles, and Sammy Lee for taking Stratford's life. Rosa, Wallace, and Sammy Lee were tried together first. Charles was tried separately. The trial started on Monday, January 26, 1948. It lasted 1 day and was a complete sham. Judge W.M. Harper presided. Before the trial began, Judge Harper appointed S. Hawkins Dykes to represent the Ingrams. He was a prominent attorney from Americas. This was the first time in over 2 months since the incident that the Ingrams had a chance to talk to a lawyer. But he had no time to prepare, so they had no real defense at all. And because the Ingrams were the only eyewitnesses to the fight that ended Stratford's death, they had no one to corroborate what happened. The prosecution used the alleged statements given by the Ingrams to help convict them. They used them as a confession statement to establish that they had intentionally taken Stratford's life and it wasn't some sort of accident from him being bumped on the head. Rosa's landlord, C.M. Dillinger, he testified. He told the jury that he was not aware of any feud or bad blood between Rosa and Stratford, but he said that he had told Rosa before to keep her animals on her half of the property and out of Stratford's crops. Stratford's wife, Irene, also testified. She said that her husband, John, came into the home and immediately grabbed his weapon. He then turned around and said that he was going to put down some livestock. Irene said that she didn't see the fight between her husband and the Ingrams, but that she knew her husband was not the aggressor because he was a very small and weak and feeble man, and he was a kind man, and he wouldn't do what the Ingrams were saying that he did that day. But the most damning testimony came from Sheriff Devane. He told the jury that when the Ingrams were in jail in his custody, Rosa and 2 of her sons willingly confessed to there being 2 fights and not 1. He said the Ingrams told him that Stratford began to attack and beat Rosa. The sons managed to disarm Stratford and he ran back towards his house. That's when the boys chased him down and began to fight with him some more. The sheriff said that Rosa and 2 of her sons then hit Stratford with a rifle and a hoe and a claw hammer that were grabbed from a nearby tool shed that was close to Stratford's home. The prosecution went to great lengths to show that Stratford died after the second fight inside of Shealy County. The prosecution showed photos to the jury of the scene where the second fight allegedly occurred. They also called witnesses to help establish this. The medical examiner was called and testified that Stratford had wounds that were made from a sharp instrument like a claw hammer. The examiner said that the claw hammer was the fatal blow and it went through Stratford's skull. Now, the testimony was designed to prove that the instrument used to take Stratford's life was obtained near his home during the second fight. Rosa, Sammy, and Wallace had no one but themselves to testify on their behalf. Because there were no eyewitnesses except for them and Stratford, they needed the jury to believe them. And this was a very tall order because they were accused of taking the life of a white man during a time when black people were lynched for fun. Rosa and her sons testified in their own defense, but it wasn't the kind of testimony that you would see in today's courtrooms. A criminal defendant in Georgia at the time could testify in their defense, but they could not be questioned or cross-examined. The jury would be forced to decide whether they found the testimony credible. You're probably thinking that does not sound right, and I would agree. I don't want to go too deep into this, but let me explain why this is an important point that you should not just gloss over. Georgia was the only state in the country in the 20th century to ban testimony by criminal defendants. A person charged with a felony in Georgia was not competent to testify. They could give a statement, but it could not be under oath and it could not be guided by questions from their attorney. Defendants were simply put on the witness stand and allowed to talk. It was up to the jury to weigh that statement and decide how they felt about it. This was rooted in the legacy of laws that were designed to ban black people from testifying in court. After emancipation, the South had no interest in ensuring that judicial fairness existed for all. Maintaining racial dominance was the #1 goal, and using the courts to ensure unequal treatment was just one of the many ways used to keep black people on the bottom rail of society. It was one of the many tools used to keep black people down that included black codes and discriminatory policing, and jury exclusion, and judicial bias. Limiting black people's ability to testify in court made sure that black people were convicted at higher rates, and it also kept black people in second-class citizenship. The U.S. Supreme Court finally struck down this Georgia rule and ruled it unconstitutional in the 1961 case called Ferguson versus the state of Georgia. So when the Ingrams spoke in court at their trial, it meant nothing because it wasn't under oath and it amounted to a statement about what they claimed happened. They were not assisted by their attorney to help them present the statement in the best possible light to assist the jury in understanding what occurred that day. There were no follow-up questions. The jury was free to disregard it as if they had not made the statement at all. When Rosa gave her statement, she told the jury exactly what happened. She told the jury how she was attacked that day and she thought she was going to die, and how she and her boys had to defend themselves from an unprovoked attack from Stratford. Sammy and Wallace also gave statements to the jury. They said Stratford attacked their mother and they helped defend themselves. After hearing all the evidence, the all-white male jury found Rosa, Sammy, and Wallace guilty of intentionally taking Stratford's life. The jury did not recommend mercy. Judge Harper sentenced Rosa and 14-year-old Sammy and 16-year-old Wallace to death. Sammy and Wallace's age did not matter when it came to their death sentence, and that's because the justice system, especially in the Jim Crow South, had no problem sentencing black children to death. I don't want to get too deep into this topic, but the U.S. allowed the death penalty to be used on juveniles until the year 2005. 80% of all juveniles that were executed were children of color, and as you can imagine, these executions mostly occurred in former slaveholding states in the South. So Sammy and Wallace were two in the long list of black children that were sentenced to die in American Southern courts. 18-year-old Charles Ingram was tried the next day on January 27th. In a bizarre twist, he was found not guilty. Charles maintained that he had never been involved in a fight with Stratford, and Judge Harper found him not guilty and never allowed his case to get to the jury. Another Ingram, 20-year-old Jackson, was tried and convicted of stealing Stratford's billfold and sentenced to 1 year in prison. Prosecution of the Ingrams was all about race, pure and simple, and we know this not only because it was the Jim Crow era, but also because that same year that Rosa and her boys were convicted, a similar incident happened in Georgia involving a black woman and a white farmer, only in reverse. A black woman named Lottie Smith lost her life at the hands of a white farmer in Raleigh, Georgia. A 55-year-old white farmer named Carl Shearer got into an argument with a 23-year-old mother named Lottie Smith. He accused her of stealing a piece of wood. Shearer came to her home and confronted Lottie on August 2nd, 1948, and he warned her about taking wood from his fence. Lottie denied that she had done anything, and the two began to argue. He told Lottie to shut up, and Lottie said that she didn't have to. He said that he would shut her up for good. Shearer then went back to his home and grabbed his weapon, and he came back and fired at Lottie as she appeared in her doorway. He took her life right there in front of her children. The grand jury said that the farmer acted in self-defense and did not indict him. At the same time that the state of Georgia was defending its unjust treatment of Rosa and her sons, it was approving of a white man's action in taking the life of Lottie Smith. When it came to justice, all that mattered was race. It didn't matter the facts, the law, or the evidence, just race. Jim Crow was going to punish Rosa for what happened to Stratford, and it was going to protect the farmer who took Lottie Smith's life. The Ingrams case was not well known until the Atlanta Daily World, a black newspaper, began covering it. Once people found out how this family had been sentenced to death for defending themselves, it sent shockwaves throughout the black community. Rosa's mother, Mrs. Amy Hunt, along with other family members, began to reach out to black churches and organizations for help and financial support to continue the fight to free this family. Black Georgians and citizens began to mobilize to support the Ingrams. Those in the area where the Ingrams are from quickly began to spread the word about her case and to raise funds and awareness. In Atlanta, the Georgia Defense Committee was able to raise $500 in a very short period of time, and the NAACP in Georgia pledged to support them. The black press also took up the Ingrams case. The Pittsburgh Courier, a weekly black paper, took up their case with extreme urgency. The paper regularly put the Ingram story on the front page. In 1948, the NAACP National Office was able to secure the Ingrams permission to represent them in their legal case. This is the letter signed by the Ingrams allowing the NAACP to enter the fight on their behalf. It also put out a call in its monthly magazine, The Crisis, for support for the Ingrams. The NAACP also brought in prominent Atlanta attorney A.T. Walden to represent them. Before I finish this story, I need to tell you about A.T. Walden. He was a remarkable civil rights giant that you should know about. Though I can't dive into all of his accomplishments here, I want to give you just a sense of the man and what he did for black people and civil rights. Austin Thomas Walden was born in 1885 in Fort Valley, Georgia, to formerly enslaved black parents. Despite the hardships that racial discrimination created, he excelled in school and graduated from Atlanta University, which is now known as Clark Atlanta. He went to the University of Michigan Law School and graduated from there in 1911. During World War I, Walden served as an officer and became one of the first black judge advocates, which are military lawyers in the Army, rising to the rank of captain. After the war, he returned to Atlanta to practice law. He was one of the sole black attorneys in Atlanta courtrooms for many years. I talk more about him in the story I did about Dr. C.A. Spence. Walden defended Dr. Spence and his wife Drusilla, who were arrested in 1926 for refusing to get off a bus in Atlanta. The all-white jury found them not guilty. Walden was then able to sue the bus company and win. This was 30 years before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. So check out that video if you haven't seen it before. All right, so getting back to the Ingram story. With the NAACP joining the fight for the Ingrams, the attention on their case increased. People from all over the country began to pay attention to what was happening in this small Georgia area, and they also wrote to Judge Harper, imploring him to do something and to act justly. It got so bad that in March of 1948, just 1 month after the NAACP joined the case, Judge Harper publicly complained about all the attention the Ingram's case was getting and how he was being bombarded with letters and telegrams. He called it anarchy and said that he would not be influenced by outsiders. Attorneys Walden and Dykes filed a motion for new trial, and on March 25, 1948, Judge Harper held a hearing on that motion. Black people showed up in large numbers to support the Ingrams, but this was 1948 and the courtroom was segregated, so they had to sit in the balcony. Only about 30 white people showed up, and they were allowed to sit in comfort on the main level of the courtroom. Attorney Dykes put forth several arguments for why the judge should grant them a new trial. First, he argued that the jury had gone, in his words, hog wild in finding the Ingrams guilty of intentionally taking Stratford's life. He said that, at most, the Ingrams were guilty of an unintentional taking of his life. He also pointed out that the Ingrams had been denied a fair trial because they were jailed separately, weren't allowed access to an attorney before the trial, and they weren't advised of their rights during the time they were in jail and allegedly made these statements to the sheriff. Prosecutor Elijah Forrester said that the Ingrams had not been forced or coerced into making a statement, and that the evidence at trial proved that there were two fights, with the second one being the one that resulted in Stratford's death. 1 week later, Judge Harper issued his ruling. He commuted the Ingram sentence to life in prison, but he denied the motion for a new trial. This was a small victory, but Jim Crow still won. The Ingrams were going to spend the rest of their lives in prison for defending themselves against an unprovoked attack. Take a look at this. This is the Georgia Department of Corrections logbook showing 40-year-old Rosa, 14-year-old Sammy, and 16-year-old Wallace being logged into prison. Notice how it says that their sentence was changed from death to life in prison. This book documents their entry into a Jim Crow nightmare. After their sentences were commuted, NAACP Legal Director Thurgood Marshall said that the fight to free the Ingrams was only just beginning, and they were prepared to take their case as far as the law allowed them to. The campaign to free the Ingrams intensified after this. Organizations continued to raise awareness about their case. Rallies were held all across the country with Rosa's family members, including her mother Amy, participating. There was also a big push to raise funds for the legal costs and to support the Ingram family. Remember, Rosa was a mother of 12. The NAACP and the YMCA and the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper and other groups all put out calls for funds for the Ingrams. The YMCA was able to provide clothes for Rosa's children. The Americas branch of the NAACP was able to buy groceries, and the Pittsburgh Courier was able to raise $38,000 from its readers to support Rosa and the legal fund. There was even a Rosa Ingram club that was started to support the family. Support was coming in from all over for Rosa and her two sons. As funds were being raised and attention was being called to Rosa's case, all Rosa could do was think of her children. In the letter she wrote to her mother, Amy Hunt, Rosa said that while she appreciated the support for her, it was her children that she was worried about. She feared that she might lose her mind in jail. Even in jail, Rosa was still concerned and worried about and wanted to protect her kids. At the same time the funds were being raised, the NAACP and Attorney Walden were appealing their convictions to the Georgia Supreme Court. When the case finally reached the court in April of 1948, Attorney Walden and another attorney, Edward Dudley, made the arguments to the court on the Ingrams' behalf. Attorney Dykes had withdrawn from the case 2 months earlier in April. At the oral argument, attorneys Walden and Dudley argued that the Ingrams' conviction should be overturned on the grounds that they had not been advised of their constitutional rights and they had been rushed to trial, but these arguments fell on deaf ears. As Rosa awaited the court's decision, the Pittsburgh Courier published an article with Rosa telling what happened. The Courier made Rosa's case a main feature on a regular basis, and there was great interest from their readers to hear from her. But even though Rosa was trying to tell anyone who would listen the truth about what happened, it didn't matter because her fate was still left in the hands of a court that was prepared to disregard the truth and keep her in prison. 1 month later, on July 13, 1948, the Georgia Supreme Court upheld their convictions. The Ingrams would have to spend the rest of their lives in prison. With Rosa and her sons in prison, others stepped in to help care for her family. The International Workers Order raised money to send Charles and James Ingram to summer camp in New Jersey in August of 1948. After camp, Charles went around the country and helped raise money for his mother and his brother's defense. When the school year came around in 1948, Charles and James went to school in Philadelphia and lived there with their grandmother. Rosa's other 6 children were cared for by her oldest daughter, Geneva Russian. This put a strain on Geneva because her home now had 14 people living in it in a 2-bedroom cabin outside of Americus. The NAACP supported her by providing groceries and clothing for the family. As 1949 approached, the continued calls for help and for funds for the Ingrams increased the legal defense fund to $45,000. The efforts to raise funds were so successful that Attorney Walden had to tell the public to stop sending in money. There was so much money that the NAACP and the Georgia Citizens Defense Committee decided to build a house for the Ingram family. Construction of the home began in the spring of 1949, and on July 11th of that year, the NAACP gave the keys to a new home to Rosa's daughter, Geneva Russian. It was located in the same rural area that they were from outside of Americus and cost about $4,500 to build. It was said to be one of the nicest homes in the area. As people continued to support the Ingram family, there was another hard decision that was being made. Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP legal team concluded that the possibility of securing a reversal of Rosa and her son's convictions was unlikely, and that an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court would not be successful and should be dropped. This was not an easy decision. The NAACP had consulted with lawyers from all around the country to determine if there was a way to push a successful appeal, and they decided that it was not. But the fight to free the Ingrams was not over yet. The NAACP turned its attention towards trying to secure a pardon or parole for the 3 Ingrams. This would turn out to be a much longer fight than they anticipated. The years in prison began to take a toll on Rosa Lee. In early 1950, reports came out that Rosa was ill and had suffered a heart attack in prison. And Wallace and Sammy, who were teenagers when they went in, were now being raised in an environment that was not meant to nurture them, but rather to break them. Can you imagine what it was like for a 14-year-old Sammy when he was sent to an adult male prison? What he saw and what he experienced? And the same for Wallace. They were both children, but because they were black in the Jim Crow South, they weren't deserving of being treated like children. Their race said that they deserved no safety or no dignity. Take a look at this. This is the 1950 census. Wallace and Sammy are listed here along with other prisoners. Wallace was 19 and Sammy was 16. Sammy was the youngest person listed here. This document captures their injustice. It's proof of what Jim Crow justice looked like. As the fight to overturn the convictions was ended, the public opinion campaign to get the Ingrams pardoned or parole was ramping up. On March 21, 1949, the National Committee to Free the Ingram Family was formed. Its sole mission was to create public sentiment and opinion for freeing the 3 Ingrams. Chosen to lead the national organization was Mary Church Terrell. She was a crusader and a political figure who had long championed the rights of equality for black people. She was also the co-founder of the National Association of Colored Women. When she took up Rosa's case, she was advanced in her years, but to her, it was worth the fight. The committee was an all-women's organization that had come together to mobilize black women across the country for Rosa Lee's cause. The group was able to meet with Rosa in prison, where they assured her that they were working to get her released. They also saw to it that letters and cards were sent to Rosa. So much support in the form of letters and notes and cards were sent to Rosa that the prison moved her from the prison in Richmond County to one in Reedsville in April of 1949. They said that she had become so famous that they had to move her. In May of 1949, the committee held several events to bring attention to Rosa's case. They also sponsored Mother's Day rallies at black churches in Atlanta and in the North. They also went to Washington, D.C. in June of 1949 to try to talk to President Harry Truman about Rosa's case. They didn't get a meeting, but it didn't deter them. The group came back again in the fall of 1949 and hand-delivered stacks of petitions calling for President Truman to intervene in Rosa's case. But the biggest and most visible appeal for Rosa and her boys was the committee's appeal to the United Nations in the summer of 1949. In September of 49, Mary Church Terrell led a delegation of black women to the UN and presented a plea for the UN to take action on Rosa's case and on racial discrimination in the U.S. Ultimately, the UN did not take any action on the case. Terrell campaigned tirelessly for Rosa's freedom until her death in 1954. Even though the public campaign to raise awareness about Rosa's case was gaining traction, the legal process to get her release was at a standstill in Georgia. Rosa and her sons were serving life sentences, and the only way for them being released was for the governor to pardon them or the parole board to give them early release. The parole board was not required to hear any parole requests by the Ingrams before 1955, after they had been in prison for at least 7 years. Rosa and her sons were forced to remain in prison, waiting for the chance to get a hearing. As they waited inside the prison, outside, support continued for their case. The NAACP paid $20 a week for groceries for the Ingram children and gave an additional payment to Rosa's daughter, Geneva Russian. It also paid the taxes on the new home that was built for the family and also made sure that the family got Christmas donations. Even though the parole board did not have to hear the Ingram's case until 1955, that did not stop the National Committee to free Rosa Ingram from asking for early review. In 1952, the committee went to the board meeting with A.T. Walden and asked the board to give Rosa and her sons a review and to release them from prison. The board said no. All the attention that Rosa's case was getting was beginning to bother Georgia officials. In December of 1952, the committee led a delegation of 10 women to the prison to meet with Rosa, but the prison and Georgia officials had had enough by this time. On December 25th, the delegation was about 1 mile from the prison when they were pulled over by a highway patrolman and served with an injunction that forbade them from seeing Rosa. The governor of Georgia, Herman Talmadge, said that he would not have people coming to Georgia to stir trouble in Rosa's name. Undeterred, the group of women came back again the next year, in 1953. This time, they had 60 women. They met with the governor and pleaded for Rosa's case and said that she should be released, and also asked the parole board release her. Again, the board said no. In 1954, the Women's Committee for Equal Justice organized a Mother's Day campaign for Rosa. It created 2 postcards that would be sent. One was to be sent to the governor of Georgia, and the other was to be sent to Rosa in prison. The one sent to the governor had a picture of Rosa and her children in jail, and the one sent to Rosa included the artwork of famed artist Charles White. Now, this was something that I found really interesting when researching this story. If you aren't familiar with Charles White and his work, you really should be, because in my opinion, he is one of the greatest Black artists to ever live. His art really captured the Black experience with such depth and emotion. And actually, that piece behind me on my bookshelf is a Charles White. It's called Harvest. Charles White's work depicted civil rights struggles, and the Rosa Lee Ingram case was one that he supported. The piece that was included on Rosa's postcard was called Guardian. Charles White even created a piece for her and Sammy. It depicts a mother and a son in jail, just like Rosa and her 2 boys. It's a really powerful piece, and I've actually seen both of these pieces of artwork before many times, and I had no idea that they were used in such a profound and important way. It really gives me a greater appreciation for Charles White and his art. While all the attention was good for keeping Rosa's case in the public eye, it was bad for Rosa's chance of getting released early, and the NAACP warned the delegation of this. The NAACP was working quietly behind the scenes to move members of the board in the direction of releasing the Ingrams when the time came to review their case. And the NAACP was right. The continued public attention from the delegations only incensed the board more. And when the time came for the required review in 1955, supporters once again came and asked for the Ingrams' release. A group of women came to the Board of Pardons and lobbied for them. The board held a hearing and quickly rejected the parole request. It did the same thing in 1956. In 1957, the parole board sent hints that it might be ready to release the Ingrams. The Pittsburgh Courier ran an article telling its readers not to rock the boat or do anything that would ruin the Ingrams' chances of review. But the board once again rejected releasing them in 1957. In 1958, it was believed that the board was once again prepared to release the Ingrams. But at the parole board hearing, an old foe showed up to oppose their release. The prosecutor from the Ingrams trial, Elijah Forrester, who is now a U.S. congressman, personally came to the board meeting to request that Ingrams remain in prison. And with that, the parole board denied the request once more. But finally, in 1959, the board voted to release the Ingrams. After 11 years, their Jim Crow nightmare was finally over. But they had lost so much time because of injustice. Rosa went in at 40 and came out at 51. Sammy went in at 14 as a teenager and came out as a 25-year-old man. Wallace, who went into prison at age 16, was now 27. They had been raised in prison by injustice and racism, and who knows what they experienced and what they went through. The Ingrams were paroled to Atlanta businessman C.R. Yates. He secured housing for them. He also got Rosa and her sons jobs in Atlanta after the parole board rejected an offer for the 3 Ingrams to go and live and work in Philadelphia. Finally, mother and sons were free and together again. When she was asked how she felt about being released after 11 years, Rosa simply said, "Wonderful." This is an image of Sammy and Wallace, now grown men and free from the shackles of prison. They're enjoying a milkshake, their first in 11 years. Rosa Lee Ingram died on August 5, 1980, at the age of 76. Sammy died in December of 2002, at the age of 69. Wallace died in January of 2013, at the age of 82. Rosa's daughter, Geneva, died in March of 1999, at the age of 77. What the Ingrams went through is what life was like for black people during this time period. One day, you could be sharecropping and not bothering anyone, and the next thing you know, you're being sentenced to die along with your teenage sons. What happened to Rosa and her family happened to countless more black people. There was no escape from injustice if you were black. Sooner or later, it was going to come knocking at your door. You just prayed that it did not destroy you or take your life. Rosa and her family were not lynched, but they still suffered, and they lost so much. And they lived with this pain for the rest of their lives. I want to know your thoughts on this story. Had you ever heard of the Ingrams, and how did it make you feel learning all that they went through? Leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.